The smell reached the road before the cabin did. Tar and pine smoke, sharp and wrong for the open prairie. A freighter hauling salt to Wood River pulled his team to a stop and stared. A man with a stiff leg was nailing black-coated boards to the outside of a log cabin while a girl sat on an overturned bucket, cutting dark fibers into measured lengths with a knife. The boards overlapped like the planking on a river scow. Pitch glistened in the seams. The freighter watched for a full minute. Then the girl looked up, thin face, wind-raw hands, eyes completely calm, as if what she was doing made perfect sense and everything beyond the cabin walls did not. The claim was 3 miles past the last neighbor and a full day's ride from the Wood River. Merritt Cale arrived in the second week of January, 1888, with a 12-year-old girl who could not stop coughing and $31 folded inside a Bible he no longer read. The previous claimant was dead. Nobody had told Merritt how the man died, only that the cabin was available and the Homestead Act filing still valid if someone occupied and improved the land before spring. 160 acres, 5 years of residence, a small registration fee. That was the promise. The reality stood 16 feet by 20, built from cottonwood logs that had not been properly cured, chinked with river mud already cracking in the dry cold, roofed with tar paper and a layer of sod so thin that grass roots poked through like the hair on a sick man's scalp. Merritt set down the trunk and told Nora to stay inside. The girl pressed herself against the cracked stove, still wearing every piece of clothing she owned, and watched him through the doorway. He walked the perimeter of the cabin in 9 steps per side. The wind came from the northwest and did not pause. It hit the log walls and found every seam the mud had surrendered. He could hear it inside, not howling, not dramatic, just a steady thin whistle that sounded like something being slowly emptied. The dead man's marks were still there, cracked clay between logs, a blackened stovepipe wired to a roof beam with baling wire, a ledger on the floor showing unpaid lumber credit at Kettering's store, a jar of bacon grease frozen solid, 2¼ cords of wood stacked against the east wall, half of it green cottonwood that would smoke more than it burned. Merritt Cale was 46 years old. He had spent 23 of those years on whaling ships out of New Bedford, Massachusetts, and the rest trying to forget them. His left knee had been stiff since a fall on the foredeck of a bark called the Doris K. His right palm carried a white ridge of scar tissue from a cutting-in accident that had nearly cost him the hand. His lungs were roughened by years of night watches in North Atlantic cold. He was not a farmer. He had never planted a row or birthed a calf or judged soil by the color of its dust. He had come west because the sea had killed his younger brother, Thomas, and because land promised the one thing the ocean never did, a fixed place, a place that did not move under him, a place where a man could die in his own bed and be found by someone who knew his name. Thomas's daughter, Nora, was the inheritance, not money, not property. A child with thin wrists and a cough that came when the air turned cold and did not leave until spring. Thomas had drowned off the Azores in a storm that also took the ship's cook and a boy from Connecticut whose name Merritt could no longer remember. The debts followed. Thomas owed money to the outfitter, the boarding house, a dentist in Fall River. The creditors sent letters to Merritt because there was no one else. He sold what he had. He paid what he could. He took the girl and headed west because the passage money was spent and the homestead claim was the only thing of value left to give her. He could not go back east. There was nothing to go back to. The local township clerk, a thin man named Lowell, who smelled of camphor, had explained the situation on the ride out. The claim could be contested if it appeared abandoned or unimproved. Another man, Lowell did not say who, had already asked about the parcel. Merritt had until the spring filing to demonstrate habitation and improvement. If he left, If the cabin stood empty, if anyone could argue he had not worked the land, the claim would revert. 160 acres of flat prairie grass, and it might as well have been the whole world. Nora coughed again from inside the cabin. The sound was small and dry, like a stick snapping. Merritt looked at the woodpile. 2¼ cords. He had asked at the general store what a man needed to survive a Nebraska winter. The answer came from 3 different men, and none of them agreed on much, but they all agreed on one thing: 6 cords. Minimum. 7 if you were heating for a child. 7 if the wind came from the north for more than 3. He was the township assessor, which meant he decided whether a homestead was being properly improved, and he had been deciding things for so long that his opinions had the weight of weather. He did not knock. He pushed the door open with the head of his cane and stood in the frame, letting cold air pour in around him like water through a broken hull. His eyes moved from the cracked stove to the baling wire on the pipe, to the frozen grease jar, to the girl sitting on the floor with a blanket around her shoulders. Then he looked at Merritt. "Show me the wood," Braith said. They walked to the east wall. Braith tapped the top of the stack with his cane, then pulled a piece from the middle and held it up. Green cottonwood. He dropped it. 2 cords, he said. 2¼ Merritt said. 2 cords of burnable wood. The rest is green. You will smoke yourself blind before it gives you heat. Braith walked to the north wall of the cabin and pressed his palm flat against the logs. He held it there for 3 seconds, then pulled it away and showed Merritt the dust of dry mud on his fingers. Your chinking is powder. I can see daylight through the northwest corner without squinting. He tapped a log joint with the cane. A piece of clay the size of a $1 coin fell to the ground. You have gaps wide enough for a knife blade. You have green wood. You have 2 cords and change. You need 6. 7 if the girl keeps coughing. Merritt said nothing. Braith walked the full interior. He kicked the stove door open and looked at the firebox. He checked the roof where the sod met the tar paper. He pressed his weight against the south wall and felt it give slightly. When he finished, he stood in the center of the room and rested both hands on the head of his cane. "You're not a farmer," Braith said. "No." "What are you?" "Sailor. Retired." Braith looked at him the way a man looks at a horse he has already decided not to buy. "Mr. Cale, I have been assessing claims in this township for 11 years. I have seen men come out here with less than you have, and I have seen men come out here with more. The ones who make it are the ones who know what they are looking at. You're looking at a cabin that will not hold heat past February, a wood supply that will not last past the first real cold snap, and a stove that is cracked from crown to ash door." He paused. "The man who had this claim before you, he died in March. Not January, not February. March. He almost made it. Almost is the word they put on a lot of stones out here." "I am not leaving," Merritt said. "I did not say leave. I said you should know what you are standing in." Braith put his hat back on. "Re-chink with fresh mud. Bank the walls with straw and snow. Cut wood every day the weather allows. Sleep close to the stove. That is what every man here does." He looked at Nora. "Keep the girl warm. That is not advice. That is the minimum." Braith turned to leave. At the door he stopped. He looked back at Nora. "Girl, how old are you?" 12, Nora said. Her voice was steady. She did not look away from him. 12. Braith repeated it the way a man repeats a number he has been asked to carry. He pulled the door open. The wind hit him in the chest, and he leaned into it without seeming to notice. "I will be back in 3 weeks to check improvement. If I see the same cabin I see today, I will note it in the filing record. That is not a threat, Mr. Cale. It is procedure." He left without closing the door. The wind came in behind him and scattered the mud dust across the floor. Nora watched the dust settle on her blanket and did not brush it off. Merritt stood in the cabin and listened to the whistling through the walls. Every seam was a mouth, every crack was an invitation. The stove burned and the heat rose and the walls gave it away as fast as the wood could make it. He could see the math, and the math was simple. If he burned 3 armloads a night to keep the room above freezing, the 2 cords would last 5 weeks. Winter would not end for 12. He could cut more wood, but his knee would not survive weeks of hauling from the river timber 3 miles south, and he could not leave Nora alone for a full day's trip. He could re-chink, but the mud would crack again in the next dry spell. He could bank with straw, but he had no straw and no money to buy it. Everything Braith had said was true. The conventional answer was more fuel, more mud, more labor, more time spent fighting the same losing exchange. Heat escaping through walls that could not hold it. A man burning himself out to feed a fire that warmed the prairie more than it warmed his child. That night, the temperature fell hard enough that the water bucket grew a skin of ice while the stove still burned. Merritt lay on the floor beside Nora and felt the cold press through the log wall behind his back like a hand. Not the absence of warmth, the active presence of something trying to get in. He had felt this before, not on land, on the sea. The memory came without asking. 20 years earlier, below deck on the Doris K, a man named Abner Tull had pressed Merritt's face against a hull plank and told him to feel the air. Abner was 60 then, a ship caulker from Nantucket who had sealed more seams than he could count, and who spoke about wood the way some men spoke about horses, with a respect that bordered on argument. He had pulled Merritt down to the lower hold, where a seam between 2 planks had begun to weep. Not leaking, not yet, just damp, just enough to darken the oakum. "Put your cheek here," Abner said. Merritt did. The plank was cold. "Now, feel the air." There was a draft, thin, almost nothing, but present. A thread of moving air that meant the sea was finding a path through the hull before the water had even begun to show. Abner drove a length of oakum into the seam with a caulking iron. The hemp was dark with tar and smelled like rope left too long in the rain. He packed it tight with a wooden mallet, short strokes, working the fiber into the gap until the wood swelled around it. Then he held a candle close. The flame had been trembling before, bending toward the draft. Now it stood still. "A ship does not sink because the ocean breaks the hull," Abner said. "It sinks because the ocean finds where the hull was never finished." Merritt had filed the lesson the way sailors file most lessons, somewhere between useful and forgotten. He had not thought about Abner Tull in years. The old man had died of pneumonia the winter after Merritt left the sea. But lying on the cabin floor in Nebraska, feeling the cold push through the log wall behind him, the memory returned with the force of a wave breaking over the bow. The cabin was a hull. The wind was the ocean. He sat up. Nora was asleep, her breathing shallow but steady. The stove glowed through the crack in its door. Merritt picked up the candle from the floor and held it near the northwest corner where Braith had knocked the chinking loose. The flame bent sideways. Not a gust. A steady, constant deflection. Air was not seeping through the wall. It was being driven through, pushed by the pressure of wind against every crack, every shrinkage gap, every place where mud had dried and fallen away. This was not a cold problem. It was a wind problem. A stove could fight cold. A stove could not fight constant air exchange. Every crack was a channel, and the wind used them all. The cabin was not failing because the materials were weak. The logs were sound enough. The stove could generate heat. The cabin was failing because it presented too many seams to direct pressure. Every joint between every log was an open invitation for moving air to push through, carrying heat out and cold in. More mud would crack, more fuel would burn away. The exchange would never stop as long as the wind had paths. On a ship, Merritt knew, you did not fight the ocean by making thicker planks. You fought it by eliminating the paths. You overlapped, you packed, you sealed. You made the hull shed water by giving it no entry point, by making every surface a continuation of the surface beside it so the pressure slid along instead of pushing through. He could do the same thing with wind. The idea formed not as a flash, but as a sequence. A second skin around the cabin. Overlapping pine planks, each one covering the joint of the one below it by 3/4 of an inch. Not a thicker wall, a smarter wall. A wall that shed wind the way a hull shed water. The seams between boards would be packed with oakum and sealed with pine pitch and tar, the same materials that kept the Atlantic out of a whaling ship's hold. He would not re-chink. He would not bank with straw. He would build a weather shell around the cabin and make the wind slide past instead of punching through. The risk was immediate and total. Pine planking was expensive on the open prairie, where timber was scarce. He would need roughly 600 board feet, 4 small barrels of pine tar and pitch, a sack of oakum, nails, hinges for a storm door, and sheet tin for a heat shield near the stovepipe. The only source was Kettering's general store, and Kettering did not extend credit out of kindness. Merritt had $31. The lumber alone would cost more than $20. If the method worked, the cabin would burn less fuel and hold more heat. His 2 1/4 cords might stretch. The walls would shed wind instead of channeling it. Nora might stop coughing. If the method failed, he would have spent his last money on wood he could not eat and tar he could not burn. He would have no cash, no reserves, and a cabin wrapped in boards that did nothing. He held the candle near the wall again. The flame bent, steady, patient. The wind did not stop. Merritt made the decision before morning. Rufus Kettering ran the only general store within 15 miles, and he ran it the way certain men run anything they control completely, with patience, arithmetic, and an understanding that other people's need was his inventory. He was 48, thick through the shoulders, with hands that had unloaded enough freight to make them permanently calloused, and a voice that carried the particular flatness of a man who had stopped being surprised by anything a long time ago. When Merritt walked into the store with his list, Kettering read it aloud, not to himself, to the room. Pine planks, 600 board feet. He looked up. Pitch, 4 barrels. Oakum, 1 sack. He turned the paper over as if expecting more. Nails, hinges, sheet tin. He set the list on the counter. You building a barn, Cale? A weather shell. A what? An outer skin for the cabin, overlapping boards, sealed seams. Kettering looked at him the way Braith had looked at him, but with less pity and more calculation. $22 for the lumber. Balance due after spring planting, secured against your claim improvements. Secured how? If you do not pay, the improvements belong to the store. I sell the lumber back as salvage, or I back another claimant who can use a cabin that is already boarded. Merritt understood what he was buying, not lumber, time. Time purchased at the price of everything he had and secured against the only thing he owned. If the method failed, Kettering would take the boards, the claim would be contested, and Merritt and Nora would have nothing. He counted out $22 in worn bills. Kettering folded them with one hand. Elias Voss came to see the work 3 days later. He was 39, a neighboring farmer 2 miles southeast, with a face that looked like it had been carved from the same material as the land, brown, dry, lined in places where the wind had found him most often. He was not a cruel man. He was a tired one. 5 years on the prairie had taught him that effort alone did not save anyone, and he had buried enough hope to be suspicious of any new version of it. He found Merritt stripping bark from the first pine planks behind the cabin. Pitch was heating in an iron kettle over a small fire. The smell was sharp and dark, the smell of docks and shipyards, completely wrong for a Nebraska homestead. Elias watched for a while. Then he spoke. "What are you sealing against?" "Wind," Merritt said. "Oh. Wind comes through every house on the prairie. That is how a house breathes." "A house does not need to breathe through every crack in the wall." Elias stepped closer and looked at the first planks Merritt had nailed to the north wall. They overlapped at the edges, each board covering the seam of the board below it. Between the boards, dark fibers of oakum were visible, pressed into the joints. "A house that cannot breathe will kill a man faster than winter," Elias said. "I have seen it. Family over near Broken Bow sealed their cabin with clay and tallow, woke up coughing blood. Smoke backed in. Damp rotted the floor out from under the stove. They were gone before February." Merritt did not argue. He walked to the stove pipe, pointed to a gap he had left between the outer boards and the pipe exit, and opened a small metal flap he had cut from the sheet tin. Cold air entered through the gap in a controlled stream. "Ships have bilge ventilation," Merritt said. "Open the hull and you sink. Close every vent and you suffocate. The answer is neither. The answer is you choose where the air enters and you seal everything else." Elias looked at the vent. He looked at the oakum. He looked at the pitch kettle. "You are caulking a house like a ship," he said. "I am." "On the open prairie." "Yes." Elias shook his head. Not in anger. In the particular way a man shakes his head when he has decided that another man is going to learn something the hard way, and there is nothing to be done about it. "If that tar catches from the stove heat, you will not have a house at all," he said. "You will have a bonfire with a girl inside." He left. Merritt listened to the horse fade into the distance. Then he checked the clearance between the pitch seal and the stove wall. 6 inches. He moved the sheet tin heat shield a half-inch closer. Then he went back to nailing boards. The mockery started at Kettering's store within the week. It spread the way things spread in small communities where winter kept people indoors and talk was cheaper than firewood. The story was simple. The ex-sailor from back east was building a boat on dry land. He was wrapping his cabin in pine planks and tar like a man expecting a flood on flat ground. Children dared each other to touch the black pitch. A freighter passing through called it the strangest thing he had seen since a man in Kansas tried to grow oranges in a sod house. Rufus Kettering encouraged the talk. Not obviously. He did not stand on his counter and announce that Merritt Cale was a fool. He simply read the purchases aloud whenever anyone asked, and he let the numbers do the work. 600 board feet, 4 barrels of pitch. Oakum, nails enough for a barn. All purchased on terms secured against a claim that most men in the county already considered dead. "A man who cannot farm should not hold land from men who can," Kettering said to Elias Voss one afternoon when the store was crowded enough for the words to carry. He said it casually, the way a man drops a match into dry grass and then watches from a distance. The confrontation that mattered came on a cold Tuesday. Merritt had walked to the store for a pound of nails. The room was warm and full, 6 men, 1 woman, 2 children, and Kettering behind the counter with the patience of a spider who had finished his web and was simply waiting. Deacon Braith sat by the stove, silent. Elias Voss leaned against the feed sacks. Kettering weighed the nails slowly. He had the kind of scale that required small adjustments, and he made every one of them visible. When the balance settled, He did not bag the nails. He left them on the counter. More nails than a barn, Cale. More pitch than a dock. What do you call the thing you are building? A cabin that holds heat, Merritt said. Cabins hold heat fine. Men have been building them for 200 years without caulking them like the bottom of a schooner. Kettering folded his arms. What I see in my ledger is a man who has spent $22 on lumber and is back for more nails, and who has not purchased seed, or a plowshare, or a single item that suggests he intends to farm the land he is sitting on. A man near the back, Merritt did not know his name, said, "Maybe he is planning to sail to his crop." Elias Voss, leaning against the feed sacks, said louder, "He is caulking for whales." 3 men laughed. The woman by the flour bins turned away to hide a smile. One of the children repeated it, "Caulking for whales." And the laughter came again, harder this time, feeding on itself. Kettering did not laugh. He watched Merritt the way a man watches a debtor, because that is what Merritt was. "I hope you understand, Cale, that the terms of your purchase are secured against the improvements. If you cannot pay in spring, those boards belong to me. The pitch belongs to me. The nails you are buying right now belong to me. And the claim, well," he left the sentence unfinished. He did not need to finish it. Everyone in the room understood the arithmetic. Kettering held the debt. Debt, on the prairie, was leverage. And leverage, in January, was the difference between staying and being pushed off a claim by a man with better standing and a ledger to prove it. Merritt looked at Deacon Braith. The old man sat by the stove with his cane between his knees. He said nothing. He stared at the fire through the grate. His silence was worse than the laughter because it meant the one man whose opinion could validate the work had chosen to withhold it. Braith was not mocking. He was simply not defending. On the prairie, that was its own verdict. Merritt paid for the nails and left. The cold hit him in the doorway, and he pulled his collar up against the smell of tar that still clung to everything he wore. That evening, Nora asked him about it. She had heard enough from the neighbor children who passed the cabin on their way to school and stopped to stare. "Did you make us look foolish?" she asked. The question came from a 12-year-old who had already lost her father to the sea and her home to debt, and who understood, with the clarity that children develop when they have no room for confusion, that reputation was a resource as tangible as firewood. Merritt set down the caulking iron. "Foolish as freezing with a fire lit," he said. He did not explain further. He picked up the iron and went back to the north wall. Construction began in earnest during the 3rd week of January. 6 weeks remained before the deepest winter stretch. 6 weeks to wrap a cabin in a second skin that had never been attempted on a prairie homestead. Merritt marked his progress on the inside of the door frame with a carpenter's pencil he had carried from New Bedford. Each mark was a station. North wall stripped and measured, east wall boards cut, seams packed, pitch boiled, storm door framed but not hung. The marks formed a line that grew 1 notch at a time, and on bad days it did not grow at all. The physical cost was immediate. His hands, already scarred from the cutting-in accident, split open again under the combination of cold air and hot pitch. Pine tar stuck to his palms and would not wash out. His knee swelled after any time on the ladder, and by the end of each day he descended the rungs sideways, lowering his weight onto his good leg and dragging the stiff one after. He skipped meals twice that first week, not from lack of food, but because the nails were running short and a half-pound cost money he had allocated for flour. The north wall went first. He stripped the worst of the old chinking, revealing gaps that Braith had not even seen. In one spot near the roofline, he could fit 3 fingers between the logs. He nailed the first pine plank flush against the bottom log and worked upward, each board overlapping the one below by 3/4 of an inch. The overlap was precise. He measured it with a notch cut into a scrap of pine, the same method he had used to check oakum depth on the Doris K. Between each board, he pressed oakum fibers into the joint with a caulking iron, packing the hemp tight with short taps of the mallet. Then he heated pitch in the kettle and brushed it over the seam with a stick wrapped in burlap. The tar smoked. His coat absorbed the smell until he reeked of shipyard, and Nora told him he smelled like something that had been left too long near a dock fire. He did not argue. The smell meant the seams were sealed. The first setback came on the 5th day. A warm afternoon softened the pitch on the east wall before it had fully cured. 3 seams sagged and lost their seal. He had to scrape them clean, reheat the pitch, and start again. Half a day lost. He marked nothing on the door frame that night. The second setback came on the 7th day. A hard freeze split 3 boards on the north wall along the grain where the wood had dried too quickly. Replacing them cost boards he had measured for the west wall. The schedule compressed. The arithmetic shifted. 600 board feet had seemed sufficient. Now it seemed optimistic. On the 8th day, a boy no older than Nora rode up on a mule and handed Merritt a folded paper. It was from Kettering. The note was short and written in a hand that pressed hard enough to score the paper. A reminder that the first balance of $4 was due on February 1st, and that failure to pay on the date specified would constitute grounds for accelerated collection under the terms of the purchase agreement. The language was not Kettering's. He had copied it from something, but the message was clear. The clock was not only weather, it was money. Merritt folded the note and put it in his Bible beside the 9 remaining dollars. And still the wind came. Every night, steady, patient, finding the walls he had not yet reached. Merritt could hear the difference now. On the north and east, where the overlapping boards and sealed seams covered the logs, the wind struck and slid. The sound was a low hiss, almost like water running over stone. On the south and west, where the old logs still stood naked, the wind found the cracks and sang through them, thin, high, constant. 2 voices, one side of the cabin shedding air, the other side drinking it. He tested the difference with the candle on the 8th night. On the east wall, the flame stood almost straight, a faint tremor, nothing more. On the west wall, the flame bent 45 degrees and guttered. The same stove, the same room, 2 different weathers depending on which wall you stood beside. The proof was in his hands, but proof did not build faster. Tell us in the comments, have you ever been doubted by someone who did not understand what you were building? Merritt did not answer them with words. He answered with another board. On the 9th day, Nora coughed hard enough to bring up blood. Not much. A fleck on her palm that she tried to hide by closing her fist. Merritt saw it anyway. He carried her to the warmest corner of the cabin, the southeast, where 2 walls of new boards had already cut the draft, and wrapped her in both blankets. He fed the stove until the cracked door glowed orange. The room warmed to something bearable, but on the north side, where the old logs still stood exposed, the candle flame still bent. Half the cabin was sealed, half remained open. Winter was not waiting for him to finish. The next morning he rose before the sun and climbed the ladder to the roof line of the east wall. His knee ground like sand in a gear. His breath came in white bursts. Below him, Nora slept near the stove. Above him, the sky was the color of ash, and to the northwest, the clouds had the dense, flat look that men on the prairie learned to read the way sailors read the color of the sea. Something was coming. He could feel it in the air the way Abner Toll had taught him to feel a draft through a hull plank, not by seeing it, not by measuring it, but by pressing close and letting the movement speak. The east wall was done. The north wall was done. The south wall was half finished. The west wall, the wall that faced the prevailing wind, the wall that mattered most, had not been started. Merritt Cale had 37 boards left, $9 in his Bible, a kettle of pitch that was running low, and a child who was coughing blood in a cabin that was half a ship and half a sieve. The wind did not care what he had finished. It cared only about what he had not. The woman arrived on the 11th day, and she did not come to help. Barbro Lunde was 58 years old, Norwegian by birth, widowed twice, once by the sea and once by the prairie, and she lived 2 miles northwest in a house that was half sod and half timber frame, built by her second husband before the fever took him in '85. She was a cooper's daughter from a village near Bergen, where men made barrels for salt cod and herring, and she had grown up with the smell of pine tar and the sound of staves being steamed into shape. Her hands were wide and rough, and missing the tip of her left ring finger from a hoop-setting accident when she was 14. She did not talk about it. She did not talk about most things unless the thing in question was being done wrong. She came because Nora had dropped a mitten on the road 2 days earlier, and Barbro had found it frozen into a wheel rut. She rode up on a gray mare that looked as tired as she did, tied the horse to the remains of a fence post, and walked around the side of the cabin without knocking. She found Merritt ruining a batch of pitch. He had the kettle over a fire that was too hot, and the pitch was bubbling in thick, angry bursts that threw black specks onto the snow. The smell was acrid, not the clean, dark scent of properly heated tar, but the sharp stink of something being cooked past its tolerance. Merritt was stirring with a stick and cursing under his breath, which was the only cursing he did, because Nora was inside and he had made a rule about language that he kept even when no one was listening. Barbro watched for 10 seconds. Then she picked up a flat board from the scrap pile, walked to the kettle, and knocked the lid sideways onto the fire. The flames dropped. The bubbling slowed. "You are cooking it angry," she said. Merritt looked at her. He had pitch on his forehead and frost in his beard, and the expression of a man who had been interrupted in the middle of a mistake he was not ready to admit. "Pitch is not water," Barbro said. "You do not boil it. You warm it. When the surface moves in small circles like oil in a pan, it is ready. When it spits, you have killed it. Dead pitch cracks in cold. Living pitch bends." She held out the mitten. "Your girl dropped this." Merritt took the mitten. He looked at the kettle. The pitch had settled into a slow, dark rotation, thick as molasses, the bubbles gone. "How do you know pitch?" he asked. "My father made barrels. Barrels hold because the staves overlap and the seams are sealed. I've been sealing things since before you were born." She looked at the cabin wall, the north side, where the overlapping boards gleamed with black tar. She stepped closer. She pressed her palm against a seam the way Braith had pressed his palm against the old chinking, but where Braith had been looking for failure, Barbro was looking for craft. "You overlap 3/4 of an inch," she said. "Yes." "Who taught you?" "A ship caulker. Years ago." Barbro nodded. She ran her finger along a pitch line, then held the finger up and examined it. "Too thick here. You're wasting material where the boards sit tight. Save the heavy pitch for the gaps where wind can wedge." She pointed to the corner where the north wall met the east. "And your corner boards are square. Wind strikes a square corner and pushes into the joint. On a barrel, you round the staves at the chime. On a house, you should round the corner with scrap." "I do not have scrap for that." "You have warped boards behind the woodpile. I saw them. Warped wood bends. Bent wood rounds a corner." She did not ask permission. She walked to the woodpile, pulled two twisted planks from the bottom of the stack, and carried them to the northeast corner. She held one against the joint at an angle, showing how the natural curve of the warped wood could bridge the gap between the two flat walls. A barrel holds because every surface leads to the next surface, Barbro said. No edge, no corner where pressure can lodge. You have built a good hull, Mr. Cale, but you have left the bow square. Merritt stared at the warped board against the corner. The fit was not perfect, but the principle was clear. A rounded outer corner would deflect wind the way a ship's bow deflected water, sliding the force along the surface instead of letting it strike flat and push through the joint. He did not thank her. He picked up his hammer. Barbro stayed for 3 hours that first day. She did not help with the heavy work. She watched, corrected, and demonstrated. She taught Merritt to warm the pine boards near the fire before nailing them so the wood would not split under the nail heads in the cold. She showed him how to stagger the seams, not running every joint in a straight vertical line from ground to roof, but offsetting each row so that no single crack could channel wind from bottom to top. She mixed a handful of fine ash from the stove into a small batch of pitch and painted it along the lowest seam on the north wall, where blowing grit and ice crystals would abrade the surface hardest. Ash makes the pitch rough, she said. Rough pitch holds grit instead of letting grit cut the seal. These were not lessons from a book. They were lessons from a lifetime of working with wood, tar, and the forces that tried to get through them. Barbro taught the way her father had taught her, by doing the thing in front of someone and expecting them to see why it mattered. Merritt saw. The days compressed. Each one was shorter than the last, and the cold deepened in stages, like a man descending stairs in the dark. By the end of the second week, the south wall was finished. The overlapping boards ran from sill to roofline, every seam packed, every joint pitched. The corner fairings, Barbro's suggestion, wrapped the northeast and southeast corners in curved scrap that turned the flat log joints into rounded edges. The tar smoke hung low over the cabin in the mornings and drifted south, and the children who passed on the road to the schoolhouse held their noses and called it the boathouse, and dared each other to touch the black walls. Nora had become the silent second worker. She cut oakum fibers into measured lengths using a knife Merritt had sharpened on a river stone. She labeled the nail tins with chalk marks, long nails, short nails, roofing nails, and carried them to wherever Merritt was working so he did not have to climb down the ladder to find what he needed. She did not complain. She coughed less on the sealed side of the cabin, and she coughed more when the wind shifted and found the open west wall, and she tracked the difference without being told because she was 12, and because 12-year-olds who have lost everything pay attention to the things that keep them alive. Elias Voss came back on the 15th day. He did not announce himself as a friend. He dropped 2 warped boards at the foot of the ladder and said, "Too twisted for decent use. Do what you want with them." He did not look at the walls. He did not ask about the method. He left. But the boards were long enough for 2 more corner fairings, and Merritt understood the language of a man who could not say help without calling it disposal. Barbro returned every second or third day. She brought nothing except knowledge, and once a jar of rendered fat for Nora's chapped hands. She and Merritt developed a working rhythm that was not friendship exactly, but something adjacent to it. The recognition between 2 people who understood materials, pressure, and the cost of imprecision. She told him about her father's cooperage in Bergen, about staves cut from mountain spruce and steamed over stone hearths until they bent like green willow. He told her about the Doris K and Abner Toll, and the sound of a mallet packing oakum into a seam below the waterline while the Atlantic pressed against the other side. "Your Abner and my father would have understood each other," Barbro said one afternoon while Merritt fitted the last plank on the south wall. They both knew that the thing trying to get in is always smarter than the thing trying to keep it out. You do not win by being stronger. You win by leaving no path. On the 18th day, Deacon Braith returned. He rode the same bay mare. He carried the same cane. He walked the perimeter of the cabin the way he had walked it before, but this time the surface he touched was not crumbling mud, but smooth, pitched pine. He tapped the north wall with his cane. The sound was solid. He pressed his palm against the sealed seams. Dry. He looked at the corner fairings, the staggered joints, the controlled vent near the stovepipe. He said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "The west wall is not done." "No," Merritt said. "The west wall faces the wind." "I know." Braith looked at the remaining stack of boards. He counted them the way a man counts money, quickly, accurately, without moving his lips. "You're short. You have maybe 30 boards. The west wall needs 40 to cover it properly with overlap." "I know that too." Braith tapped his cane against his boot. "I will note in the filing record that the cabin shows improvement. That buys you until spring." He paused. "It does not buy you until February if the west wall is open when the wind comes." He left. Merritt counted the boards again. 34. He needed at least 40 for the west wall with proper overlap and seam coverage. 6 boards short. 6 boards he could not afford, because Kettering's price for pine had risen since the first purchase, and Merritt's $9 had to cover the February payment, flour for Nora, and kerosene for the lamp. 6 boards. The difference between a cabin that shed wind on all 4 sides and a cabin that shed it on 3 and swallowed it on the 4th. Mulvery. Barbro solved the problem without calling it a solution. On her next visit, she brought a bundle of tarred canvas she had cut from a wagon cover her second husband had stored in the sod house loft. The canvas was stiff, dark, and smelled of age and linseed oil. "You cannot plank the whole west wall," she said. "So plank what you can and hang canvas over the rest. Tack it at the top, weight it at the bottom, and seal the edges with pitch where canvas meets board. It will not last 2 winters. But it does not need to last 2 winters. It needs to last 1. Merritt looked at the canvas. It was not elegant. It was not the overlapping, interlocking system he had built on the other 3 walls. But it would block the direct wind path through the upper west wall where the worst gaps lived, and it would buy time for the boards below it to do their work. He nailed the last 34 boards to the lower 2/3 of the west wall. The upper third he covered with Barbro's canvas, tacked tight at the top, weighted with a strip of scrap wood at the bottom, edges sealed with a thick bead of pitch. The corner fairing on the northwest wrapped the joint between board and canvas, and the pitch held the transition smooth enough that the wind could not wedge beneath the cloth. It was not perfect. He could hear the canvas snap in a strong gust, and the sound reminded him of a sail luffing in a crosswind. But when he held the candle to the interior wall behind the canvas, the flame trembled instead of bending, trembled, not bent. The difference between a draft and a whisper. The cabin was sealed, 3 walls in overlapping pine with pitched seams and oakum packing, 1 wall in pine and canvas, patched and imperfect but closed. The storm door hung on new hinges with a gasket of tarred rope around the frame. The stovepipe exited through a tin heat shield with a controlled vent that Merritt could open or close with a wire hook. It was the 23rd day of January, 1888. The first test came that night. A wind out of the northwest hit after sunset and held until dawn. Not a storm, a rehearsal. Merritt damped the stove to half and sat in the center of the cabin with the candle. On the north wall, the flame stood straight. On the east wall, straight. On the south wall, straight. On the west wall, near the canvas patch, a tremor. The flame leaned 1 degree, maybe 2, but it did not bend. It did not gutter. He checked the water bucket in the morning. No ice skin. The stove had been damped for 7 hours, burning at half its usual rate, and the room had held above freezing through the night. He had used 1 armload of wood. On a normal night with the old walls, he would have used 3. Merritt scratched the numbers on the door frame beside his construction marks. Stove at half. Room at 58 degrees by his rough thermometer. A strip of paper with marks he had calibrated against the freezing point of the water bucket, and 1 armload instead of 3. The numbers meant something. 1 armload instead of 3 meant his 2 1/4 cords of wood would stretch 3 times further. It meant the fuel that should have lasted 5 weeks might last 15. It meant Nora might sleep through the night without the cold waking her. But 1 calm night proved nothing. Elias Voss said so when he heard the numbers. "A quiet wind is not a storm," he said. "Every man's cabin holds on a quiet night. Show me what it does when the prairie means it." Deacon Braith, hearing the early results through the township gossip, sent word through Lowell the clerk. Still air can be its own danger. A sealed house traps smoke, damp, and sickness. I will reserve judgment. Rufus Kettering told customers at the store that the tar walls would catch fire from the stove heat before February, and that anyone who copied the method was buying kindling, not shelter. He said it with the confidence of a man who had already calculated what the salvage would be worth. Barbro came on the 25th. She inspected every wall. She found 1 flaw. On the lower south wall, Merritt had sealed the boards too completely. The pitch line ran unbroken from the ground to the first row of overlap, leaving no gap for meltwater to escape. When the stove heated the interior wall and snow melted against the outer boards, the water would have nowhere to go. It would pool behind the planks, freeze overnight, expand, and split the seams from inside. "Cut a weep channel," Barbro said. "Here, below the first board, a gap no wider than a knife blade, angled downward so water runs out and wind cannot push in." Merritt resisted. Every instinct from 23 years at sea told him that a gap was a leak, and a leak was death. You did not cut holes in a hull. Barbro picked up his caulking iron and held it like a teacher holds a pointer. A barrel holds because it knows where pressure goes. Water presses inward, and the staves direct it down to the drain. If you seal the drain, the barrel bursts from inside. Your house is the same. The enemy outside is wind. The enemy inside is water that has nowhere to leave. He cut the weep channel. It took 4 minutes. It felt like cutting a vein. The days that followed were strange. The cold continued, but the wind softened. Mornings came with a yellow-white glare in the sky that Merritt had never seen on the ocean, but that the old settlers recognized with an unease they could not always explain. On January 10th, the temperature rose. On January 11th, it rose further. By the morning of January 12th, children walked to school without heavy scarves. Men stood outside Kettering's store with their coats unbuttoned. A woman hung laundry on a line for the first time in weeks. The wind died, not slowly, completely. The prairie grass stood straight. The smoke from every stovepipe rose vertically into a sky the color of old milk. Elias Voss stopped by the cabin that morning. He was in a good mood, which was rare for him. "Warm day," he said. "Your caulking can rest." "The caulking does not rest," Merritt said. He was standing at the west wall, checking the canvas patch for signs of loosening. He had not unbuttoned his coat. Elias looked at him. "You worry like a sailor." "Sailors worry when the wind stops," Merritt said. "It means the wind is gathering somewhere else." Elias laughed and rode away. His youngest son, a boy of 7, sat behind him on the horse, legs too short to reach the stirrups. Merritt watched them go. Then he went inside and fed the stove until the firebox glowed. He filled the water bucket. He brought in 4 extra armloads of wood and stacked them beside the door. He checked the vent. He checked the storm door gasket. He checked every seam he could reach without a ladder. Nora watched him from the corner where she sat with the brown paper drawings she had begun to make, wall sections marked with Merritt's measurements and Barbro's corrections, labeled in a child's careful hand. "Is something wrong?" she asked. "I do not know yet," Merritt said. He did not know, but the stillness had a weight to it, and the sky had a color he had seen once before, years ago, in the North Atlantic, in the hours before a storm that dismasted a brig and killed 3 men who had been standing on her deck 60 seconds before the wind arrived. The storm hit after noon. There was no warning that would have satisfied a man who needed warnings delivered politely. The temperature did not drop slowly. It fell as if the bottom had been cut from the air. 1 hour the sky was pale and warm. The next hour the northwest horizon turned black, and the wind struck the prairie with a sound that was not a howl, but a roar, the sustained, pressurized roar of air being forced through a space too small to hold it. Snow came sideways, not falling, driven. The flakes were small and hard, more like sand than snow, and they hit the cabin walls with a hiss that Merritt could hear through the sealed boards. Within 10 minutes, visibility dropped to 20 feet. Within 20 minutes, he could not see the woodpile from the door. The razor wind. That is what the people of Wood River would call it afterward, when they had buried enough dead and repaired enough damage to need a name for what had happened. The storm that came after the warm day, the blizzard that struck the Great Plains on the 12th of January, 1888, sudden and absolute, and without the courtesy of a gradual approach. Merritt's first thought was not the cabin. It was Nora. Nora was not home. She had gone to Barbro's house that morning with mending, a torn shirt, and a request that Barbro teach her to sew a straighter seam. The walk was 2 miles. Merritt had let her go because the day was warm, because Barbro's house was solid, because a 12-year-old girl needed to be somewhere other than a tar-smelling cabin with a man who checked seams instead of talking. 2 miles. In this wind, 2 miles was a death sentence for anyone caught in the open. Merritt stood at the storm door and gripped the frame. The wind hit the west wall, and the canvas patch snapped like a gunshot. He could feel the house shudder, not the sealed walls, which held, but the roof beams, which flexed under the lateral pressure. Snow found the gap beneath the canvas patch and sifted through in a fine white line that melted on the floor and ran toward the stove. He could go after her. 2 miles in blinding snow with a stiff knee and no rope line. Or he could trust Barbro's sod house to hold and stay where the cabin could protect him. He chose to trust Barbro. It was the hardest decision he had made since leaving New Bedford. If you are invested in this story, subscribe and stay with us, because the next hour inside this cabin decides whether Merritt's strange black-walled house becomes a shelter or a tomb. The second complication arrived 20 minutes later. A pounding on the storm door, not a knock, but a flat, desperate hammering that shook the tarred rope gasket loose on one side. Merritt pulled the door open against the wind, and the snow came in like a wall of white sand, stinging his face, filling his eyes. Elias Voss stood in the doorway. He was holding his youngest son against his chest. The boy's face was the color of ash. His lips were blue. His eyes were open, but they were not seeing anything that was in front of them. "Our wall came apart," Elias said. His voice was stripped of everything except fact. "Windward side. Chinking blew out in a straight line from the roof to the sill. Snow is in the room. Stove cannot keep up." He was shaking, not from cold alone, from the particular shaking that comes when a man has been running with a child in his arms and his body has not yet understood that it can stop. Marta stayed. She is trying to block the cracks with quilts. I could not carry both. Merritt pulled them inside. The door fought him like a sail catching wind. He kicked it closed, and the tarred rope gasket caught on the frame, not perfectly, not the clean seal it had been, but enough. He pressed his weight against the door until the latch held. Inside, silence. Not perfect silence. The wind was still there. He could hear it along the west wall, a low hiss where the canvas patch flexed and the sealed boards took the pressure. But the difference between outside and inside was the difference between drowning and breathing. The roar became a murmur. The driving snow became a faint sifting along the floor beneath the canvas. The stove flame, which had been guttering when the door opened, steadied and stood straight. Elias Voss stood in the center of the room and looked around. He was still holding his son. Snow melted off their coats and ran across the floor in thin streams. The boy coughed, a deep, wet cough that sounded nothing like Nora's dry rasp, and everything like the cold settling into his chest. Your candle, Elias said. Merritt looked at the candle he had left on the shelf beside the north wall. The flame stood straight, perfectly vertical. In a storm that was tearing the chinking from log cabins a mile away, the flame in Merritt's cabin did not bend. How? Elias said. It was not a question. It was the sound of a man watching the thing he had dismissed perform the thing he had said it could not do. Merritt wrapped the boy in Nora's blanket and set him near the stove. He opened the vent to refresh the air, a quarter turn of the wire hook, held for 10 seconds, then closed. Fresh cold air entered in a controlled stream, mixed with the warm air near the ceiling, and the slight staleness that had been building cleared within a minute. The storm screamed outside. The boards on the west wall took the full force of the wind. Merritt could see the canvas patch flex inward, with each gust, bellying like a sail, then snapping back as the gust passed. But the pitch held the edges. The tacks held the top. The weighted scrap at the bottom kept the canvas from lifting. And the boards below the canvas, the overlapping pine planks with their packed oakum seams and their staggered joints, did not move at all. The wind hit the surface and slid along it, finding no crack, no gap, no open seam where it could wedge through and force the cold inside. The rounded corner fairings on the northwest and southwest corners deflected the wind's direct strike. Instead of hammering the flat log joints, the gust curved around the corners and passed on. Merritt could hear the difference. A smooth hiss at the corners instead of the sharp whistle that meant penetration. Hours passed. Merritt fed the stove every 90 minutes instead of every 30. The room held. The temperature near the stove stayed above 60 degrees by his rough thermometer. The temperature at the far wall, the east side, furthest from the stove, read 48. Cold, but livable. Not the killing cold that was happening in every unsealed cabin on the prairie. Elias told him what was happening at his own house. The windward wall had failed in a vertical line, exactly what Barbro had warned about when she taught Merritt to stagger his seams. The chinking between the logs had dried and cracked during the warm spell, and when the wind hit, it blew the mud out in a straight channel from roof to sill. Snow poured through the gap. Quilts nailed over the cracks pulsed inward with each gust, trapping frost between the fabric and the logs, making the insulation worse instead of better. The stove roared at full draft and could not keep the room above freezing because the air exchange through the cracked wall was faster than the fire could compensate. I burned 6 armloads in 2 hours, Elias said. 6, and the ice on the bucket never melted. Merritt said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not sound like gloating, and gloating was not what the moment needed. Elias's wife was still in that cabin. His home was failing. The man sitting on Merritt's floor was not a skeptic anymore. He was a father whose child was turning blue. The boy warmed slowly. Color returned to his fingers first, then his cheeks. He asked for water. Merritt gave him warm water from the kettle, not hot, and the boy drank it in small sips and did not cough again. At 7 in the evening, the door shook again. Merritt opened it, expecting another neighbor. Instead, two figures tied together at the waist with hemp rope stumbled through the entrance covered in snow so thick they looked like they had been carved from it. Barbro Lunde and Nora Kale. They had followed the fence posts by touch, moving from one post to the next with their hands outstretched, the rope keeping them within arm's length of each other so that if one fell, the other would know. Barbro's right cheek was white. Frostbite. The skin had the waxy, hard look of flesh that had stopped feeling anything. Nora's hands were raw, but she was conscious, and the first thing she did when the door closed was look for Merritt. She found him. She did not run to him. She simply nodded, the way a sailor nods when a ship reaches port, an acknowledgement that the crossing was completed and that acknowledging it was enough. Barbro collapsed onto the floor beside the stove. She smelled smoke immediately. The air in the sealed cabin, with 5 people now breathing and the stove burning, had thickened. "Vent," she said. One word. Merritt opened the wire hook a full turn. Cold air rushed in through the controlled gap beside the stovepipe, and the staleness cleared. Barbro had been inside for 15 seconds, and she had already saved them from the danger that Elias had warned about months ago, the danger of a house that could not breathe. The vent stayed open a crack. The temperature dropped 2 degrees. The air stayed clean. 5 people in a cabin 16 by 20 feet, sealed against a storm that was killing everything it touched outside. The stove burned. The walls held. The wind struck the overlapping boards and found no path. It hit the rounded corners and slid past. It pushed against the canvas patch, and the pitch held the edges, and the snow that sifted through melted on the floor and ran toward the weep channel that Barbro had made Merritt cut, the tiny gap that he had resisted, the drain he had called a vein, now carrying meltwater out of the wall instead of letting it pool behind the boards and freeze and split the seams from inside. Every lesson had a purpose. Every correction had a reason. The cabin held not because Merritt had built it alone, but because Barbro had finished what he started. The storm raged for 14 hours. Dawn came gray and slow, the wind still gusting, but the worst of the driving snow spent. Merritt opened the storm door at first light and saw a world he did not recognize. Snow had drifted 4 feet against the west wall and 2 feet against the north. The woodpile was buried. The fence posts were gone. The prairie was white and flat and featureless, as if someone had erased everything that had been there before and left only the wind to remember it. Elias Voss left at dawn to find his wife. He found Marta in the barn entry, lying across the threshold with the calf pressed against her side. She had tried to move the animal indoors when the barn wall groaned, and the cold had caught her before she could get back to the house. She was alive. Her fingers on her left hand were white to the second knuckle. She could not stand without help. But she was alive, and the calf was alive, and the fact that both of them had survived a night in a barn entry when the temperature had fallen past 20 below told Merritt something about the stubbornness of women on the prairie that he would not forget. Jory Pells was not alive. They found him that afternoon, half a mile from his cabin, face down in a drift. He had gone out after a missing team of horses, and the storm had closed around him before he could turn back. His cabin door was open. His stove was cold. The chinking on his windward wall had held well enough to keep the room habitable, but Jory Pels had not been inside when it mattered, because he had made the choice that the storm counted on, the choice to go outside and fight it on its own terms. Merritt stood over the body while three men lifted it onto a board. He did not know Pels well. He knew that Pels had laughed loudest at the store when Elias said, "caulking for whales." He knew that Pels had a loud voice and an easy opinion and no family that anyone had mentioned. The death was not justice, and it was not karma, and it was not the kind of thing a man could point to and say, "The frontier punished those who mocked." Jory Pels died because he went outside. That was all. The cold did not care what a man believed about his neighbor's cabin. They covered the body with a blanket, and someone said a prayer, and Merritt walked back to his cabin, where the stove still burned and the walls still held, and the candle flame beside the north wall still stood straight. Inside, he checked his rough thermometer marks. During the worst of the storm, the 12 hours from the first gust to dawn, the cabin had held above 60 degrees near the stove and above 48 at the far wall. He had burned less than 2 full armloads. Elias, by his own account, had burned 6 armloads in 2 hours and failed to keep his cabin above freezing. The difference was not strength. It was not luck. It was the path the wind was given and the path it was denied. Merritt sat beside the stove and listened to the wind diminish. Nora sat beside him with her brown paper drawings on her knees. Barbro slept near the wall, with her frost-bitten cheek wrapped in a cloth soaked with rendered fat. Outside, the prairie was white and still and scattered with the evidence of houses that had breathed where the storm chose and not where the builder chose. The cabin had held, but holding was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of what came after, the question that survival always leaves behind, which is not whether you lived, but what you do with the fact that others did not. The neighbors came to Merritt's cabin because smoke still rose cleanly from his stovepipe, and no snow had sifted through his walls. They came in ones and twos over the 3 days following the storm, on foot or on horseback, stamping snow from their boots, and staring at the black-pitched boards the way a man stares at something he has already decided to disbelieve but cannot ignore. The evidence was physical. They could touch it. The inner wall was dry. The floor had no frost lines. The stove burned low, and the room was warm, and a child slept under a blanket near the east wall without coughing. The first validation was silent. A farmer named Hook, Merritt had seen him once at the store, but never spoken to him, pressed his bare palm against the sealed north wall and held it there for 5 seconds. He pulled it away and looked at his hand. Dry. Warm. He looked at the overlapping boards, the pitched seams, the corner fairings. He did not say anything. He put his glove back on and left. The second validation was not silent at all. Deacon Asa Braith arrived on the 3rd day after the storm. He rode the same bay mare. He carried the same cane. But he did not walk the perimeter the way he had before, measuring, testing, looking for failure. He dismounted slowly, tied the horse, and stood in front of the west wall where the canvas patch still held, and the pitched boards below it gleamed with a thin coat of ice that had melted and refrozen in the weak January sun. He came inside. He stood in the center of the room, both hands on his cane, and turned in a slow circle. He looked at the walls. He looked at the stove. He looked at the vent beside the pipe. He looked at the weep channel on the south wall, where a thin track of moisture ran down the outer boards and dripped into the frozen ground. Then he removed his glove. He pressed his palm against the sealed north wall, the same wall where 3 weeks earlier he had pressed his palm and shown Merritt the dust of crumbling chinking on his fingers. No dust. No cold. The wall was solid, dry, and faintly warm from the stove heat trapped inside. Braith held his hand there for a long time. When he spoke, his voice had the particular quality of a man saying something he has already said to himself several times and is now saying aloud because it has become unavoidable. "I have judged houses by the size of their timber," Braith said, "by the thickness of the chinking, by the weight of the sod on the roof and the number of cords stacked against the wall. I measured every cabin in this township by how much it could hold." He paused. "I should have measured them by what they let through." He looked at Merritt. "Your method works. I do not fully understand it. But I watched Elias Voss burn 6 armloads in 2 hours and lose the fight, and I am standing in a room that burned 2 armloads in 12 and won it. I will note that in the record." It was not an apology. Braith was not a man who apologized. It was something more useful. An acknowledgement from the one person in the township whose opinion carried the weight of authority. The claim was safe. The filing would note improvement. And the man who had looked at Merritt like a horse he would not buy was now looking at the walls like a student who had found a lesson he had not expected. Braith left. Merritt did not celebrate. He fed the stove and checked the canvas patch and began planning how to replace it with proper boards when the weather allowed. Elias Voss came the next day. He did not ride. He walked, which meant his horse was needed elsewhere, which meant something at his homestead was still broken. He stood in Merritt's doorway with his hat in his hands and the particular expression of a man who has rehearsed what he wants to say and hates every version of it. "I need you to look at my wall," he said. They walked to Elias's cabin together. The damage was worse than Elias had described during the storm. The windward wall, the west face, had lost its chinking in a vertical line from the roof beam to the sill log, exactly as Barbro had predicted. The gap was wide enough to see daylight through. Snow had packed into the space between the logs and melted and refrozen in layers, pushing the logs apart at the joint until the wall bowed outward by nearly an inch. The quilts Elias had nailed over the cracks were still there, frozen stiff, crusted with ice on the interior face. They had trapped moisture between the fabric and the wood, creating a layer of frost that insulated nothing and rotted everything. Merritt pulled one quilt free. The log behind it was dark with damp. "You covered the wound without draining it," Merritt said. "The coal was already inside the wall. The quilt held it there." Elias stared at the log. "I thought if I blocked the air, the room would warm." "Blocking air and sealing air are not the same thing. You blocked the surface. The path was still open behind it." Merritt pointed to the vertical crack. "This line runs straight because your chinking dried in one piece. When the wind hit, the whole strip blew out at once. If the seams had been staggered, broken at different heights, the crack would have stopped at each break. One section might fail. The rest would hold." Elias looked at him, staggered. "The way shingles overlap, the way planks on a hull are offset. No straight path from one end to the other." Merritt ran his hand along the crack. "Your cabin is not ruined. The logs are sound. The problem is the joints and the corners. If you board the windward face, even just the west wall, and pack the seams properly, the next storm hits a surface instead of a sieve." Elias was quiet for a long time. The wind moved through the crack and into the room where Marta sat with bandaged fingers, and the boy played on the floor with a stick. "I thought a breathing house meant a living one," Elias said. "Mine breathed all night and nearly killed us." "A house must breathe where you choose," Merritt said, "not where the storm chooses." The words surprised him. They were not his. They were Barbro's, reworded, the barrel logic applied to log walls. He heard her voice behind his own and felt the absence of her in the room like a draft through a sealed wall. present not because the seal had failed, but because he knew what the seal was supposed to feel like. Within a week, men came to Merritt's cabin with boards, rope fiber, pine knots, and questions. They came not because they trusted him, but because they had no better option. Their cabins had failed. Their chinking had cracked. Their wood supplies had been savaged by the storm, and the one cabin that had held, the black-walled, tar-smelling, boat-shaped cabin that they had laughed at in Kettering's store, was the only evidence anyone had that the next storm could be survived differently. Merritt refused to sell a secret. He drew a seam pattern in stove ash on the cabin floor and made each man crouch beside it and trace the lines with his finger. Overlap. Pack. Seal. Vent deliberately. He repeated the 4 words until they became a rhythm, and he made each man say them back before he would answer any other question. "Why oakum?" a man named Torger Moen asked. He was young, 26, with a new claim north of town, and a wife expecting their first child in March. "Oakum swells when it gets damp," Merritt said. "It fills the gap tighter when moisture enters. Mud does the opposite. Mud shrinks when it dries and cracks when it freezes. You are choosing a material that fights you or a material that helps you. Where do I get oakum out here? You make it. Untwist rope. Soak the fibers in rendered fat or pine tar. Cut them to length. You already have the material. You have been throwing it away." Torger Moen left with a piece of rope and a jar of tar. He came back 2 days later with his west wall boarded over 4 feet high, not enough to cover the full face, but enough to protect the worst joints, and the seams packed with homemade oakum that was rough and uneven but sealed. His wife, Sigrid, came with him on the second visit. She was 7 months along and had spent the blizzard night sitting upright against the warmest wall of their cabin, because lying down meant lying in the draft that ran along the floor. She did not ask about boards or pitch. She asked Merritt how much wood they had burned during the storm. 2 armloads in 12 hours, Merritt said, with the stove at half. Sigrid looked at Torger. "We burned everything we had stacked inside," she said. 4 armloads in 6 hours, and the water bucket still froze. The numbers told the story that no argument could. Merritt's cabin, sealed and vented, had used 1/3 the fuel and held 3 times the heat. The difference was not a theory. It was a measurement. And on the prairie, where firewood was labor and labor was time and time was the distance between survival and failure, a method that cut fuel consumption by 2/3 was not a curiosity. It was a lifeline. This was how the method spread. Not as a system delivered whole, but as pieces borrowed, adapted, and applied to whatever each family could afford. One man boarded his windward wall. Another sealed his door gasket with tarred rope. A third covered his roof joints with overlapping scraps and pitch. None of them built a full weather shell. None of them needed to. The principle was the same at every scale. Find where the wind enters and close the path. Merritt noticed something during the teaching that he had not expected. The men listened to him, but they watched Nora. The girl sat in the corner with her brown paper drawing spread across the floor, and when a man asked a question that Merritt had already answered with his ash diagram, Nora would hold up the relevant drawing without being asked. The cross-section of the wall, the angle of the weep channel, the placement of the vent. Her drawings were clearer than Merritt's explanations because they were visual, labeled, and precise in the way that a 12-year-old who has learned to pay attention to details can be precise when the details are the difference between warmth and cold. She was becoming the record. He was the builder. She was the keeper. Rufus Kettering watched the spread from behind his counter with the expression of a man whose inventory is moving and whose control is not. The problem for Kettering was double. First, the lumber and pitch and oakum that men were buying was not coming through him in the quantities he had planned. Merritt was teaching people to make oakum from old rope and to render their own pitch from pine knots. The materials that Kettering sold at marked up prices were being replaced by materials the settlers already had. Second, Merritt's willingness to teach freely undercut Kettering's leverage. If the method belonged to everyone, Kettering could not charge for access to it, and a storekeeper who cannot control access to the thing his customers need is a storekeeper who has lost his position. Kettering's first response was commercial. He began selling what he called cale boards, pre-cut pine planks marketed as the same lumber Merritt had used. The price was 40% higher than the lumber Merritt had actually purchased. When Torger Moen complained, Kettering said, "Quality costs. You want to seal your house, or you want to gamble with your wife?" His second response was personal. He told customers quietly at the counter that Merritt's help was not free, that the sailor was building influence the way other men built fences, claiming territory that was not his, positioning himself as an authority on houses when he could not grow a row of corn. He told Elias Voss that Merritt's advice would be worthless in a wet spring because pitch sealed out water as well as wind, and a house that could not dry would rot before harvest. The words traveled. They did not travel as fast as the evidence of the storm, but they traveled, and in a community where trust was measured in seasons and Merritt had been present for less than one, the storekeeper's doubt carried weight. Barbro Lunde's frostbite did not heal cleanly. The white patch on her right cheek scabbed and peeled and scabbed again through the last weeks of January. She kept working. She came to Merritt's cabin every third day, inspected the repairs he was making to the canvas patch, corrected his pitch mixing, argued with him about the proper angle for the weep channels on the east wall drainage. But her right hand, which had been exposed during the fence post walk, had lost feeling in 2 fingers. The tips turned dark. By the first week of February, infection had set into the tissue beneath the nails. She did not complain. She wrapped the fingers in clean cloth and continued mixing pitch with her left hand. But Merritt saw the way she held tools, gripping with 3 fingers instead of 5, turning her wrist to compensate, resting the hand in her lap when she thought no one was looking. They worked together through February on improvements to the cabin and modifications to the method for different house types. For sod walls like Barbro's own house, they designed a raised plank skirt on the windward face only, a half wall of overlapping boards that covered the vulnerable lower section where wind struck hardest and water pooled. For frame shacks, they used thinner boards and tarred cloth beneath the seams as a secondary barrier. For log cabins like Elias's, they prioritized corners, roof lines, and door gaskets, the 3 points where the most air exchanged, rather than attempting a full wrap when lumber was scarce. The collaboration was not always smooth. They disagreed about pitch thickness. Merritt wanted heavy coats, the way a ship's hull was sealed below the waterline, thick enough to resist abrasion, heavy enough to fill every imperfection. Barbro wanted thinner coats, the way a cooper sealed a barrel, enough to block moisture, light enough that the wood could still move with temperature changes without cracking the seal. "A ship sits in water," Barbro said during one of these arguments. "Water pressure is constant. Wind pressure is not. The wind gusts, releases, gusts again. If the pitch cannot flex with the wood beneath it, the pitch will crack, and the seal will fail the first time the temperature swings 20 degrees in a day." "A thin coat will erode in one season," Merritt said. "Then you recoat in one season. A thick coat that cracks in February is worse than a thin coat that lasts until April." She was right. He knew she was right because he had seen it. The heavy pitch on the lower north wall had already begun to show hairline fractures where the wood had expanded during a warm afternoon and contracted overnight. The thinner coat on the east wall, where Barbro had supervised the application, remained smooth. He did not tell her she was right. He simply began mixing thinner batches. She noticed and said nothing, which was her version of accepting his concession. In the evenings, when the work was done, and Nora sat with her brown paper drawings, Barbaro told stories about her father's cooperage. She described the smell of spruce shavings on a stone floor, the sound of a mallet driving a hoop down a swelling barrel, the way her father tested a seal by filling the barrel with water and watching for darkening on the outside, the same principle as Merritt's candle test, but with liquid instead of flame. She told him about her first husband, a fisherman from Stavanger who drowned when she was 23, and her second husband, the Nebraskan farmer who built the sod house and planted wheat and died of fever without seeing a single harvest reach the granary. Merritt told her about Abner Tull, about the Doris K, about the sound of oakum being packed into a seam below the waterline, while the Atlantic pressed against the other side, about his brother Thomas, who could climb rigging faster than any man on the ship, but could not swim and died because the ocean did not care about the things a man could do above the surface. "You're Abner and my father," Barbaro said again, the way she had said it before. But this time she finished the thought. They both understood that the thing you are sealing against does not stop trying. It finds the next weakness, and the next. The work is never finished. You only earn the right to do it again. The infection took 2 of Barbaro's fingers in the second week of February. The township doctor, a man who traveled the circuit and arrived when he arrived, cut them at the knuckle and packed the wounds with carbolic. Barbaro sat through the procedure without sound and walked to Merritt's cabin the next day with her hand wrapped in fresh cloth and her eyes set against any expression of sympathy. "Do not look at my hand," she said. "Look at your roof line. The pitch along the north ridge is too thick and it is cracking." But the hand did not heal the way the fingers had not healed. The cold, the exposure, the work with pitch and rough wood, it kept the wounds open. By the end of February, Barbaro made a decision that Merritt saw coming the way a sailor sees a storm, from a distance, with time to brace but not to change course. She had relatives near Omaha, a sister's family with a frame house and a wood stove and a doctor who did not travel a circuit. She could winter there. She could heal. She could come back in the spring if the hand allowed. The departure was quiet. She came on a Tuesday morning with her mare loaded and a small trunk tied behind the saddle. She gave Nora a Cooper's compass, a brass divider her father had used to scribe barrel heads, and told the girl to keep drawing. Then she walked to the cabin one last time and pointed to the junction where the storm door met the frame. "The gasket will shrink in spring warmth," she said. "When it does, retar it. Do not wait for the next cold snap to tell you. Check it on the first warm day. Warm days are when you repair. Cold days are when you need the repair to hold." It was her last lesson, and it was the one that mattered most, not because of the gasket, but because of the principle. Maintenance was not a response to failure. It was a practice that prevented failure. Barbaro had lived her entire life inside that principle, sealing and resealing, checking and rechecking, because she understood that the forces pressing against a wall or a barrel or a life did not take breaks and did not send warnings. She stood in front of Merritt's cabin and looked at the walls she had helped finish. The black pitch gleamed in the weak February light. The corner fairings rounded the joints. The canvas patch on the upper west wall flexed slightly in the wind, but held. "You learned the wind," Barbaro said. "Teach the rest before they make it smaller than it is." Merritt did not know what to say. He had spent 23 years on ships where men left without ceremony because leaving was what men did, and he had spent the last 6 weeks with a woman who understood pressure and seams and the behavior of wood under cold, and the space she left when she rode northwest toward the Omaha road was not a gap in his labor. It was a gap in the thing that made the labor make sense. He stood in the doorway until the mare disappeared into the flat gray distance. Then he went inside and checked the pitch on the north ridge. It was cracking, exactly as she had said. Nora sat on the floor with the Cooper's compass in her lap, turning it slowly, opening and closing the brass arms the way her father might have opened and closed a spyglass on the deck of a ship he would never come home from. She looked up at Merritt and said nothing. She did not need to. The room was the same room it had been an hour ago, same walls, same stove, same warmth held inside the same sealed boards. But the quality of the silence had changed, the way the quality of light changes when a cloud passes, not by removing the sun, but by altering the nature of what it touches. The cabin held the warmth. The wind found the walls and slid past. But something had left that the pitch could not seal, and Merritt felt it the way Abner Toole had taught him to feel a draft, not by seeing it, not by measuring it, but by pressing close and knowing that the stillness was not the same as before. The late March storm hit on a Wednesday. It was not a blizzard. It was worse in some ways because it was wet. A driving rain mixed with sleet that came from the southeast on a wind that shifted twice in 6 hours. The temperature hovered just above freezing, which meant the moisture did not pack as snow. It ran. It pooled. It found every surface that was not angled to shed it and collected there with the patience of something that had been waiting for exactly this invitation. The houses that had copied Merritt's method partially, the ones that had boarded windward walls and sealed door gaskets and packed seams with homemade oakum held against the wind. The overlapping boards shed the rain the way they had shed the blowing snow. The oakum swelled in the moisture and tightened in the joints. The pitch deflected the water along the surface and down. The houses that had copied only the pitch, the ones that had sealed their walls with tar without adding Barbro's drainage channels, without cutting weep gaps, without angling the lowest boards to direct water away from the foundation, failed. Water ran behind the sealed boards. It pooled in the gap between the outer skin and the log wall. It had nowhere to go. The pitch that had blocked wind now blocked drainage. The water sat, and as the temperature dropped overnight, it froze. Ice expanded in the trapped space. Seams split from inside. Boards bowed outward. Nails pulled free. The worst failure was at the schoolhouse. The schoolhouse had been sealed 3 weeks earlier by a crew of 4 men using materials purchased from Kettering's store at Kettering's prices. They had followed the visible part of Merritt's method, overlapping boards, pitched seams, without understanding the invisible part. No weep channels, no drainage angles, no staggered seams on the lower wall where meltwater would accumulate. They had built a shell that shed wind but trapped water, and the March storm proved the difference. The south wall of the schoolhouse bowed outward 3 inches at the midpoint. The children had been sent home before the storm, but the building was the community's largest investment, and the damage was visible from the road. Men gathered in the sleet and stared at the bulging wall and the split seams where ice pushed through the pitch like white fingers. Rufus Kettering stood among them. He had sold the lumber. He had sold the pitch. He had priced the materials at a premium because they were, in his description, the same quality Merritt used. He had not sold the knowledge because the knowledge was free and Kettering did not deal in free things. Merritt arrived at the schoolhouse within the hour. He did not wait to be asked. He could see from the road that the wall was failing from inside, and he knew, because Barbro had taught him, because the barrel logic was clear exactly what had gone wrong. This was the moment the mentor's departure became more than loss. It became test. Barbro was not here to point at the flaw, to knock a lid aside, to say the words that made the problem visible. Merritt had to see it himself. He had to hear her voice inside his own reasoning and trust it the way he had trusted Abner Toole's voice when he first pressed his face to the cabin wall and felt the draft. He walked to the bulging south wall and pressed his palm flat against the lowest board. Wet. Not damp from rain striking the surface. Wet from behind. Water trapped inside, pressing outward. He ordered the men to pry the lower boards loose before the ice expanded further and split the frame. 3 men resisted. Pulling boards off a wall they had just paid to install felt like tearing money from the building. Merritt did not argue. He picked up a pry bar and pulled the first board himself. Behind it, a sheet of ice 2 inches thick clung to the log wall. Water ran from beneath the ice as the warmer air hit it. "This is what happens when you seal without drainage," Merritt said. He said it loud enough for Kettering to hear, but he was not looking at Kettering. He was looking at the wall. Water entered at the top where the roofline meets the boards. It ran down behind the skin. It had no weep channel to escape through. It pooled at the bottom, froze, and pushed the boards out from inside. He cut relief gaps in the lower boards. He pried 2 more loose where the ice had already split them. He showed the men how to angle the lowest board outward by a fraction of an inch, tilting the bottom edge away from the wall so that water would drip free instead of running behind the skin. He made them cut weep channels below each drainage point, small gaps, knife blade width, angled downward. "The method can fail," Merritt said to the men standing in the sleet. "It fails when you copy the surface without understanding the path. Wind is one enemy, water is another. If you seal against wind and trap water, you have traded one death for another." He did not mention Kettering's materials. He did not need to. Every man present could see the lumber that had been sold at premium prices now bowing and splitting, because the knowledge that should have accompanied it had not been included in the price. If this story reminds you why preparation matters, share it with someone who needs to hear it, because the lesson was never the black pitch. It was learning where the danger enters. Rufus Kettering's response came 2 days later, at the store, in front of enough witnesses to ensure the words would travel. "Cale changed the rules," Kettering said. "He sold one method, and now he teaches another. The boards I sold were sound. The pitch I sold was sound. If the schoolhouse failed, it failed because Cale's method is not the method he claims it is. He changes the details to keep himself necessary." It was a clever accusation. It reframed Merritt's evolving teaching, the addition of drainage channels, the refinement of pitch thickness, the lessons Barbro had contributed, as inconsistency rather than improvement. It suggested that the method was unreliable because it required ongoing knowledge that only Merritt possessed, and that Kettering's simpler version, boards, pitch, nails, done, was the honest product. Merritt heard about the accusation from Elias Voss, who repeated it with the uncomfortable expression of a man who could see both sides and did not enjoy the view. Merritt's answer was not a speech. He sat at his table that evening and drew a pattern sheet on brown paper, the same paper Nora used for her drawings. He drew the wall cross-section, boards overlapping, seams staggered, oakum packed, pitch applied thin, weep channels cut at the base, drainage angles marked. He labeled every element in plain language. He marked the 3 most dangerous mistakes: sealed without vent, sealed without drainage, pitch too thick to flex. He wrote across the top in block letters, "Free, copy, and keep." The next morning, he nailed the pattern sheet to the church door. Rufus Kettering tore it down before noon. Nora copied 3 more that afternoon. She walked them to Torger Moen's claim, to Elias Voss's cabin, and to the schoolhouse, where she pinned one to the repaired south wall with a roofing nail. Kettering did not tear those down. Tearing a pattern sheet from a church door was a gesture. Tearing them from 3 homesteads was a confrontation he was not prepared to have. The method was free. The knowledge was spreading. And the man who had tried to control it by selling materials without understanding was watching his leverage dissolve the way mud chinking dissolved in the wind, slowly, then all at once. Spring came to the Platte River corridor the way it came to most of the Great Plains, not as a season, but as a negotiation. Warm days followed by freezing nights, mud that hardened into ridges by morning and softened into ankle-deep ruts by afternoon. The grass came back slowly, pale green pushing through dead brown, and the wind shifted from northwest to southwest and carried a different smell. Earth instead of ice, moisture instead of dust. Merritt replaced the canvas patch on the upper west wall in the first week of April. He had been saving boards through the winter, trading labor for lumber, repairing a neighbor's door frame in exchange for 4 planks, helping Torger Moen raise a fence in exchange for 6 more. When he nailed the last overlapping board into place and sealed the final seam with pitch, mixed thin the way Barbro had taught him, the cabin stood complete for the first time. 4 walls wrapped in pine, every seam packed, every joint pitched, every corner rounded, every weep channel open and angled. The storm door hung on oiled hinges with a tarred rope gasket that Merritt checked every warm day as Barbro had instructed. He stepped back and looked at the cabin from the road. It was not beautiful. It was black-walled and low, and it smelled of tar, and it sat on the flat prairie like a thing that had washed up from somewhere else. But the walls were tight, the seams were whole, and the wind that crossed the open grass struck the surface and slid past without entering. The teaching continued through April and into May. Merritt's cabin became the place where men came before their first full winter on the plains. New settlers, arriving with spring to file homestead claims and break sod, were sent to the black cabin by Deacon Braith, who had added seam inspection to his assessment rounds, and who told every newcomer the same thing: go see the sailor, he will show you the walls. The teaching had a pattern now. Merritt would walk the visitor around the cabin exterior, pointing to each element, the overlap, the pitch, the oakum in the seams, the corner fairings, the weep channels, the vent beside the stovepipe. Then he would take them inside and light a candle near the north wall and ask them to watch the flame. It stood straight. It always stood straight. Then he would walk them to an unsealed wall on a nearby outbuilding, the small lean-to where he stored tools, and hold the candle to a crack between the boards. The flame bent. "That is the difference," he would say. "That bend is your heat leaving. That bend is your firewood burning for the prairie instead of your family." Nora drew the lesson on brown paper while the visitor watched. The wall cross-section, the seam detail, the 3 mistakes that could kill: sealed without vent, sealed without drainage, pitch too thick to flex. She had drawn the same diagram 30 times by the end of May, and each version was cleaner and more precise than the last. The lines drawn with Barbro Cooper's compass, the labels written in a hand that had grown steadier through repetition. Some men understood immediately. Torger Moen became the first to build a full weather shell on a new cabin, applying everything Merritt had taught from foundation to ridge. He staggered his seams. He cut his weep channels. He mixed ash into the lower pitch. His wife, Sigrid, gave birth in that cabin in March of '89, and the child's first night was spent in a room that held 55 degrees with the stove at quarter draft, while a spring wind pressed against the walls and found nothing open. Some men understood partially. Elias Voss boarded his windward wall and sealed his door and roof line, but left the other 3 walls in their original log and chinking state. The result was imperfect. He still lost heat through the unsealed sides, but his fuel consumption dropped by nearly half, and his wife's frost-bitten fingers healed through a winter spent in a room that no longer froze while the stove burned. Some men did not understand at all. They bought Kettering's materials and nailed boards over their worst walls without packing seams or cutting drainage, and when the boards warped, or the pitch cracked, or the water trapped behind the skin froze and split the joints, they blamed the method instead of the execution. This was the tension that Merritt carried into the second year. The method worked when it was understood, and it failed when it was copied without understanding, and the failures gave Rufus Kettering ammunition that the successes could not fully counter. Kettering's reckoning came in May. A spring gale, the kind of sustained southwest wind that came with the warming season and hit differently from the winter storms, carrying rain instead of snow and warmth instead of cold, struck the settlement on a Saturday afternoon. The wind was not extreme, 40 miles an hour, perhaps 50 in the gusts, nothing compared to the January blizzard. But it carried driven rain at a low angle, and the rain found every surface that was not properly sealed and every drainage path that was not properly cut. Kettering had sealed the front wall of his storeroom in February. He had done it himself, using his own materials at cost, and he had done it the way he understood Merritt's method, overlapping boards, pitched seams, nails at regular intervals. The front wall held. It looked proper. Customers saw it and assumed Kettering understood the method as well as the man who had invented it, but Kettering had not sealed the roof junction where the front wall met the eaves. He had not cut drainage angles on the lower boards. He had not accounted for roof uplift, the way wind passing over a low building creates suction that pulls at the upper edges of any attached surface. And he had not added weep channels, because weep channels looked like flaws, and Kettering did not sell flaws. The rain entered at the roof junction. It ran down behind the sealed front wall. It pooled at the base where no weep channel existed. It sat overnight as the temperature dropped. It froze. The ice expanded. The lower boards bowed outward. The pitch cracked along a line that ran from the foundation to the second row of overlap. When Kettering opened his storeroom Monday morning, he found water on the floor, ice along the base of the front wall, and 3 sacks of flour dark with moisture. The flour was ruined. The sugar beside it had hardened into a solid mass. A crate of tinned goods had shifted when the boards bowed, and 2 tins had split at the seam. The smell in the room was wrong, damp, and close, the smell of a space that had been sealed without being allowed to breathe. He spent the morning carrying ruined goods to the back lot. Customers watched. They did not help, not because they were cruel, but because there was a symmetry to the scene that even the kindest among them recognized. Kettering had charged them premium prices for materials and told them the method was simple. The method was not simple. The evidence was stacked behind his store in sacks that had turned to paste. The damage was visible from the road. Men who had been told by Kettering that Merritt's method was unreliable could now see that Kettering's own version of it had failed in exactly the way Merritt had warned it would fail, sealed without drainage, sealed without understanding. Kettering did not come to Merritt that day. He did not come the next day. He came on Wednesday after he had cleaned the storeroom and tallied the loss, nearly $40 in spoiled inventory, more than Merritt had spent on the entire original lumber purchase, and realized that the flour alone was worth more than the pride that was keeping him from the sailor's door. He stood in Merritt's yard with his hands at his sides and his jaw set in the particular way of a man who is about to ask for something he has spent months ensuring he would never need. "I need the pattern," he said. Merritt looked at him. He did not enjoy the moment. There was nothing in Kettering's face that invited enjoyment, only the grim recognition of a man who had confused selling materials with understanding them. "You had the pattern," Merritt said. "It was on the church door. You tore it down." Kettering's jaw tightened. "I did not come here to argue about a piece of paper. You came here because the piece of paper had the information you needed, and you destroyed it instead of reading it. I read it. Then you did not understand it." The words landed the way Merritt intended them to, not as insult, but as diagnosis. Kettering had read the drawing the way a man reads a recipe without understanding why the steps are ordered the way they are. He had seen boards, pitch, and nails. He had not seen drainage, flexibility, and the constant negotiation between what you seal out and what you trap in. I need you to show me where I went wrong, Kettering said. Merritt walked to the storeroom. He inspected the front wall. He pointed to the roof junction, the missing drainage, the absent weep channels, the pitch that was too thick and had cracked instead of flexing. He explained each failure in the same plain language he used with every settler who came to his cabin. He did not raise his voice. He did not remind Kettering of the price markups, the debt notices, the accusations at the store. He simply showed the man where the water had entered and why. He pressed his hand to the base of the sealed wall where the ice had formed. Here, you sealed the bottom tight to the ground. Water ran down behind the boards and had nowhere to exit. A weep channel here. He pointed to a spot 2 inches above the ground, a knife blade gap angled down, and the water runs out before it can freeze, the same channel that I resisted cutting on my own cabin. Barbro Lunde made me cut it. She was right. I was wrong. That is how the method works. Someone has to be willing to be wrong. When he finished, Kettering stood in his ruined storeroom, surrounded by damp flour and burst tins, and said nothing for a long time. You can sell boards, Merritt said. You cannot sell the wind a lie. Kettering looked at him. Something shifted behind his eyes, not warmth, not gratitude, but the practical recognition that fighting the method was costing more than accepting it. He was a man who understood arithmetic, and the arithmetic had changed. What do you need from me? Kettering asked. A community stockpile, lumber and oakum stored at the church, available to any family that needs it. You fund it. I teach them how to use it. You make your profit on the materials. I make sure the materials work. It was not generosity. It was a deal. Kettering understood deals. He could sell the lumber at fair price, maintain his position as the supplier, and stop losing customers to homemade oakum and salvaged boards. Merritt could ensure that the materials came with knowledge attached, that no more schoolhouse walls bowed outward because a man had bought pitch without learning drainage. Kettering agreed. He did not shake Merritt's hand. He nodded once and left. The stockpile appeared at the church within the week. Pine planks, cut to standard lengths, barrels of pitch, sacks of oakum, a posted sheet, Nora's latest drawing, approved by Merritt, copied 3 times, showing the wall cross-section, the seam detail, and the 3 mistakes that kill. Rufus Kettering's name was on the stockpile as donor. Merritt Cale's method was on the wall as instruction. The community had both, and neither man had surrendered to the other. They had simply found the place where their interests overlapped, the way boards overlap on a wall, not because they agree, but because the alternative is a gap that lets the weather in. By the winter of 1889, 6 cabins in the Wood River district had full windward shiplap skins. 3 more had tarred door gaskets and roofline seam packing. The schoolhouse had been rebuilt with a controlled vent, protected outer boards, and weep channels that Nora had inspected personally before the first frost. Torger Moen's new cabin was the finest application of the method outside Merritt's own. 4 walls sealed, corners rounded, drainage complete, and a vent system that his wife operated with a wire hook while nursing their infant in a room that held steady warmth through the coldest nights. The mockery phrase changed. Upside-down boat had been an insult in January of '88. By the autumn of '89, it was shorthand for a house that had been prepared before the weather demanded it. Children used it the way children use any phrase they have heard their parents say with pride instead of contempt, without fully understanding it, but knowing it meant something good. Is your house an upside-down boat? A boy asked a newcomer at the schoolhouse one October morning. The newcomer did not understand. The boy explained, "It means the wind cannot get in." Elias Voss became the method's most practical advocate. He had lived through its failure and its success in the same night. and he carried both experiences with the weight of a man who had nearly lost his family to a lesson he should have learned sooner. He warned newcomers about the dangers of partial application, sealing without drainage, pitching without venting, with a specificity that came from having nearly suffocated his family with quilts nailed over open cracks. When a new settler expressed doubt, Elias did not argue theory. He took the man to his own cabin and showed him the repaired windward wall and the door gasket and the vent, and he said, "I thought a breathing house meant a living one. I was wrong. Ask my wife what a breathing house means in a blizzard." Deacon Braith included seam inspection in every assessment round. He walked homesteads with his cane and his ledger, and when he found a cabin with no windward protection, he did not threaten. He simply wrote in the margin of his notes, "Recommend Cale method consultation before winter." It was not an official requirement. It was the quiet leverage of a man who had been proven wrong once and intended never to be proven wrong the same way again. In the autumn of '88, Merritt began teaching what he called wind reading, the practice of studying a homestead before the first hard freeze to identify where the wind would enter and how much damage it could do. He had learned the principle from Abner Tull, who had taught him to press his face to a hull plank and feel for movement. He had refined it with Barbro, who showed him how bubble patterns in heated pitch revealed where air pushed hardest. Now he adapted it for settlers who had neither ship caulking experience nor cooperage knowledge, men who needed to see the problem before they could understand the solution. The method was simple. On a windy day, walk the cabin with a lit candle held near every joint, every corner, every door frame, every roofline seam. Where the flame bends, wind enters. Where it bends most, wind enters fastest. Mark the worst spots with chalk. Those are the seams to seal first. A man with enough lumber for one wall should seal the wall where the flame bends hardest. A man with enough oakum for 10 feet of seam should pack the 10 feet where the flame gutters and dies. He taught this to every newcomer and made Nora draw the process on brown paper, a figure holding a candle near a wall, flame bending, chalk marks on the log joints. The drawing became as recognizable as Nora's wall cross-section. Settlers pinned it inside their cabin doors and checked their walls before every cold snap the way Merritt checked his, not because they expected failure, but because the habit of checking was itself the defense. Elias Voss took the wind-reading practice further than Merritt expected. He began walking newcomers' homesteads himself, holding the candle, marking the chalk, explaining the draft paths in the blunt, practical language of a man who had nearly lost his family to a lesson he should have learned sooner. He did not romanticize the method. He did not call it clever or ingenious. He called it what keeps you from burning all your wood in one night and freezing anyway. When a new settler resisted, when a man said the same thing Elias himself had once said, that a house needs to breathe, Elias would take the man to his own windward wall and show him the repaired boards and the sealed gasket and the vent, and he would say, "I nearly killed my son because I believed what you believe. My house breathed fine. My son turned blue." The argument ended there. It always ended there. A man's child turning blue in a cabin with a lit stove was not a theory. It was a fact, and facts on the prairie carried more weight than any principle a storekeeper could sell or a deacon could write in a ledger. Merritt Cale never fully became a farmer. His fields remained modest, enough corn and wheat to feed himself and Nora, not enough to sell. His knee prevented the kind of sustained labor that turning sod demanded, and his temperament was suited to walls and seams rather than rows and furrows. But his claim survived. The filing was approved. The land was his. And the cabin that sat on it, the black-walled, tar-sealed, wind-shedding cabin that had been laughed at, doubted, tested, and proven, became the place that newcomers visited before their first winter, the way a ship's crew visits the caulker before a voyage. He received a letter from Barbro Lund in the spring of '89. Her hand had healed enough to hold a pen, though the handwriting was different, wider, less controlled. The letters formed with 3 fingers instead of 5. She wrote about her sister's house in Omaha, about the noise of the city, about how strange it was to live in a place where the wind was blocked by other buildings instead of by one's own work. She asked about Nora's drawings. She asked whether Merritt had checked the door gasket on the first warm day. He had. He wrote back and told her so. He did not ask her to return. She did not offer to. Some partnerships are not broken by distance. They are completed by it, each person carrying the shared knowledge into a separate life, applying it in ways the other will never see, trusting that the lessons hold because the lessons were tested together. Nora grew. The girl who had arrived coughing on a freezing January day grew into the girl who kept the drawings, who labeled the nail tins, who cut oakum to measured lengths, who carried the cooper's compass in her apron pocket and used it to scribe circles on brown paper when she needed to think. By 14, she was teaching the method herself, standing in Merritt's cabin with a candle and a cross-section drawing, explaining to grown men how to stagger seams and cut weep channels and mix ash into lower pitch. The men listened to her because the drawings were precise, and because the girl spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had lived through the thing she was describing. Merritt watched her teach and felt the particular pride of a man who has given someone not a trade, but a way of seeing. Nora did not think like a sailor. She did not think like a cooper's daughter. She thought like herself, a girl who had learned from both and who saw the connections between hull and barrel and wall that neither Merritt nor Barbro had seen alone. The years compressed. 1890 brought a mild winter, and Merritt spent it replacing the pitch on the north wall. The heavy coat he had applied in his first weeks, now cracked and peeling, replaced with the thin, flexible coat Barbro had taught him. He worked alone on the ladder, his knee grinding, his hands slower than they had been 2 years ago, but steadier. When he finished, he pressed his palm to the new pitch and felt its smoothness, and he heard Barbro's voice, dead pitch cracks, living pitch bends. 1891 brought a hard February. 3 new families came to the cabin before the first storm and left with drawings in oakum and the 4-word rhythm, overlap, pack, seal, vent. One of the families was a young German couple, newly arrived from Wisconsin, who had built their cabin from plans in a homesteader's guide that said nothing about wind sealing or draft paths. Their walls were plumb, their corners square, their chinking fresh. Merritt walked their cabin with a candle and found 11 points where the flame bent. He showed them each one. The husband said, "The guide said square corners are strongest." Merritt said, "Square corners are strongest against weight pressing down. They are weakest against wind pressing sideways." He showed the man how to round the 2 windward corners with scrap boards, and the man's wife, who had said nothing until then, asked Nora for a copy of the wall drawing. 1892 brought a letter from Barbro saying her sister had died, and she was staying in Omaha to care for the sister's children. She enclosed a sketch of a barrel cross-section with a note in the margin. Compare to Nora's wall drawing. The principle is the same. It was always the same. Merritt pinned the sketch to the wall beside Nora's drawings. Barrel and wall, side by side. Stave and plank. Hoop and pitch. The same logic, wearing different clothes. 1893 brought the hardest winter since the razor wind. The temperature dropped below 0 for 8 consecutive days in January, and the wind came from the northwest without pause. Merritt's cabin held. The 6 sealed cabins held. The schoolhouse held. The 3 partial adoptions, windward wall only, doors and roofline only, held well enough. 2 new cabins, built by men who had ignored the method or never heard of it, lost their chinking on the second night and their stovepipes on the third. One family crowded into Torger Moen's sealed cabin for 4 days. The other walked to Merritt's door in the dark, and Merritt opened it and let them in because that was what the cabin was for. It had been built to survive. It survived by holding whoever needed holding. 1894 was the year Elias Voss died, not from cold. From a fall, his horse stumbled in a prairie dog hole on a September afternoon and threw him against a fence post. The injury was to his back, and he lived for 3 weeks before the swelling reached something vital. Merritt sat with him during the last days. They did not talk about the method or the blizzard, or the night Elias had pounded on the storm door with his son in his arms. They talked about small things, the quality of the corn that year, the price of nails at Kettering's, whether the schoolhouse roof needed recoating before winter. The small things were the large things, because they were the evidence that both men had survived long enough to find them worth discussing. He did not remarry. The question came up in the way such questions come up in small communities, through suggestion, through the careful steering of conversations by women who believed a man with a child needed a woman in the house. Martha Voss, widowed by illness 2 years after the blizzard, was the name most often mentioned. She was strong, practical, and she had survived the barn entry on the worst night of the worst storm, which gave her a kind of standing that no amount of domestic competence could have earned. Merritt respected her. He helped repair her cabin after Elias died. He sat with her family during the funeral and said nothing because nothing was the correct amount. But he did not court her, and she did not expect him to. They understood each other the way neighbors understand each other on the prairie, through shared labor, shared weather, shared knowledge of what the land demands. Marta brought bread to the cabin sometimes. Merritt repaired her door gasket every autumn. Nora taught Marta's younger children to draw wall cross-sections. These were not romantic gestures. They were the currency of a community that had learned to survive by sharing knowledge instead of hoarding it, and Merritt's role in that community was not husband or suitor, but something closer to what Abner Tull had been on the Doris K. The man who understood the seams, who could feel the draft before the leak, who kept the hull whole so that everyone inside could do their work without thinking about the water outside. It was enough. Some lives are completed by partnership. Some are completed by the work itself and the people who carry it forward. Merritt's later years were marked by small repairs, fewer words, and the habit of touching the west wall of the cabin whenever the wind rose. It was not a superstition, it was a practice. The same practice Barbaro had described, the constant checking, the refusal to assume that what held yesterday would hold today. He pressed his palm to the wall and felt for warmth, for dryness, for the absence of the draft that had once bent a candle flame sideways in a cabin that was more sieve than shelter. In his last years, the gesture had become unconscious. He would pass the west wall on his way to the stove, and his hand would rise and press flat against the boards without his choosing it, the way a man touches a door frame for balance or a mother touches a child's forehead without deciding to check for fever. He died in the autumn of 1897, seated in a chair beside the west wall. The day was calm. The sky was clear. The harvest was finished, what little harvest Merritt's modest fields produced, and the cabin was ready for another winter. The pitch had been recoated. The door gasket had been replaced. The weep channels were clear. Everything was in order, the way a ship is in order when the caulker has finished his rounds, and the hull is tight, and there is nothing left to do but wait for the sea. Nora found him in the late afternoon, his hand resting on the pitched boards, his face turned toward the window that looked out across the prairie. He had never fully learned to farm, but had learned, in his own way, to live with. The stove was cold. The candle on the shelf beside the north wall had burned down to a stub. Its last flame, Nora said later, had stood perfectly straight. Within 2 winters of the January blizzard, a dozen families in the Wood River district had adopted some version of Merritt Cale's windward wall method. Not every cabin became a ship. The real spread was quieter than that: tighter doors, overlapping boards on the worst exposed walls, tarred rope gaskets, protected vents, and the habit of holding a candle to a crack and watching the flame before the first hard freeze. Nora Cale preserved the drawings and taught children at the schoolhouse to test their own walls, and the children went home and held candles near cracks their parents had stopped seeing. Merritt Cale lived out his years on the same Nebraska claim he had nearly lost. He never became wealthy. He never became a farmer in any way that the word usually meant. His field stayed modest. His influence spread through houses, not harvests, through sealed seams and rounded corners, in the 4-word rhythm that men repeated to their sons the way other men repeated prayers. He died in a calm autumn beside the wall that had held back the worst storm the prairie had sent, and the cabin stood for years after him, its black boards fading to gray, its pitch cracking slowly in the sun, its seams still tight enough that the wind, when it came, found nothing open. In the winter of 1900, Elias Voss's oldest son, the boy who had arrived half-conscious in Merritt's cabin on the night of the razor wind, stood in Kettering's store and heard a newcomer ask about winterizing a cabin. The boy, now a man of 19, turned from the counter and said what his father had learned to say, the words that had replaced the old ones. "A house must breathe where you choose, not where the storm chooses." The newcomer did not understand. The young man took him to Merritt Cale's old cabin, where Nora still lived, where the drawing still hung on the wall beside Barbro's barrel sketch, where the candle still stood on the shelf beside the north wall. He lit the candle. The flame stood straight. Outside, the January wind crossed the open prairie, struck the weathered black boards, slid along the overlapped seams, followed the rounded corners, and passed on. Inside, the flame did not move. It had never moved. The wind kept speaking, the way it always had and always would, in the only language it knew. Merritt Cale had taught the houses how not to answer.